If someone told you today that your home is in a flood zone and your first reaction was, that doesn't make any sense, that reaction is reasonable. Most homes don't look like they're at risk of flooding. You don't see water nearby, you don't see any warning signs, and you've probably never personally experienced flooding where you live. So when flood insurance suddenly becomes part of the conversation, it feels disconnected from reality. This usually comes up at a moment when you're already making big decisions. You're buying a home, you're refinancing, you're reviewing insurance. Everything feels routine, and then you hear the words flood zone or flood insurance required. That moment creates tension because it feels like new information, not because you're opposed to protecting yourself. What's happening in that moment is a mismatch between how flood risk is measured and how people naturally think about risk. We think in terms of what we've seen. Flood maps think in terms of probability over time. Flood zones are not predictions, they're models. They're designed to answer a long term question based on terrain, elevation, rainfall patterns, and drainage systems. Where is water most likely to go if a major event happens? That's very different from asking whether your house has flooded before or whether flooding feels likely this year. You've probably heard the phrase 100-year flood. That phrase alone has caused enormous confusion. It does not mean flooding happens once every 100 years. It means there's roughly a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. 1% doesn't feel urgent in isolation, it sounds small, but when you stretch that risk across decades of ownership, the math changes. A 1% annual risk doesn't stay 1% over time. Over a 30-year mortgage, the cumulative likelihood becomes meaningful. That's why lenders pay attention to flood zones even when nothing looks risky on the surface. Their concern isn't next year, it's what could happen over the next full life of the loan. When you pull up a FEMA flood map, you'll see colored areas and letters. Zone A or AE generally indicates higher risk. Zone X generally indicates lower risk. What's important to understand is that lower risk does not mean no risk. It simply means the probability is lower based on the available data. This is where assumptions quietly creep in. If flood insurance isn't required, it's easy to assume it isn't necessary. But flooding doesn't check your zone letter before it happens. Heavy rainfall, overwhelmed drainage systems,